You can see the gathering around the leader. You can see the use of terror. You can see the way people start making small compromises. Right around the time of the election, J.D. Vance tweeted that my husband, Tim Snyder, who was also a professor at Yale until we both left for the Munk School very recently, he sent out a tweet saying, Tim Snyder is an embarrassment to Yale. Now, I didn't for a moment suspect that our colleagues, were more sympathetic to Vance than to Tim. I was quite sure that I understood where they stood. But nobody publicly spoke up for him.
Marci Shore is a historian, chair in European intellectual history, a professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs, and the author of the extremely acclaimed book, The Taste of Ashes, The Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe. Professor, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Zaza. Thank you for the invitation. Superbly
bizarre times we're living in, mildly put, and we're going to come to that later on. But since you're an expert in totalitarianism, which is, if I can employ a modicum of dark humor, an extremely yummy, if not the yummiest subject for every proud Eastern European such as myself. So I wanted us to explore what that is, actually, because this word gets thrown around a lot, especially when people are trying their best to annihilate each other on Twitter or something. So when we say totalitarianism, historically we usually think of Hitler and Stalin and perhaps Mussolini before them, but that's probably not really where this system of governing, for lack of a better word, really begins with just those three figures. Or does it?
Well, let me first say that all of these words that we use, totalitarianism, fascism, authoritarianism, they're all imperfect. They are all attempts to create mediating layers between the particular and the universal that will allow us to compare disparate phenomena. In real life, of course, no given historical situation is exactly the same as any other historical situation. It's also the case that once we immerse ourselves in the infinite singularity and particularity of any given event, we make it very hard to process or to see anything. There's a very famous passage in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason where he says that concepts without intuitions are empty and intuitions without concepts are blind. And so, Kant's, founding idea of epistemology was that we need both the concepts that are structuring our thoughts and the particular sensory data that is coming to us from real life in order for us to be able to think or cognize anything. There has to be some kind of synthesis of the particular data with larger structuring concepts. And that's just a basic insight that we need metaphors, we need concepts in order to be able to think. They are never perfect, and no two situations are ever identical. And so I always caution my students, do not fetishize the concepts. So we use them as hermeneutical devices, as tools, to help us think critically, but they should not be fetishized. Totalitarianism, really, as a concept, in some ways, distinct from autocracy, from authoritarianism, is born largely of the revelation that there was something fundamentally similar, in the phenomenon of Nazism and Stalinism. Despite their enmity and despite their ostensibly being on radically different ends of the political spectrum, there was something that was fundamentally similar about them. And how we use that concept really most famously and most essentially comes from Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, in which she tries to tease out what was distinctive about these forms of tyranny in contrast to other forms. And I do think it's a useful concept because as in any moment in history, you have elements of continuity and elements of discontinuity. And again, in one way or the other, they shouldn't be fetishized. We should use them to help us understand. So one of the things that Hannah Arendt said was that, okay, in previous previous corrupt and tyrannical political regimes, you always had lying in politics. There have always been a role that was played for falsehood, in political power. And she said, but these pre-modern, pre-totalitarian forms were essentially like tears in the fabric of reality. The lies were places where reality was torn. And the careful observer could spot the place where something had been severed and sewn back together. She said, what's distinctive about what we're getting in phenomenon like Nazism and Stalinism is a complete reconstruction of reality created in such a way as to be seamless. There's no longer a tear to perceive. And that was a fundamental insight. So it's not just the use of terror. It's not just the use of oppression. It's not just the fact that there's one guy in a leadership principle. It also has to do with these big existential epistemological questions, about what is true and what is false. And it has to do in a very profound way with the relationship between public and private. And among the other key insights that Arendt had is that in previous forms of autocracy, be it monarchy, sometimes more tyrannical, sometimes less tyrannical, there was always a private space that you could stay out of the way of power. And at a certain point, and most classically in Stalinism, that space disappears. There is no longer such a space because suddenly the regime is interested in everything, not just what you're doing on the street or at work, but also what you say to your lover in bed and the thoughts that are going on inside your own mind. And that was something new.
So that is basically the crucial distinction between a totalitarian state and a mere dictatorship, let's say. I'm thinking about, of course, there's a lot of legends about North Korea because it's such a secretive and closed off society, but apparently they have radios that they can't really turn off, even when they're, at home, that they're always projecting these speeches. I don't know. But that made me think of there's really no private space anymore where you can retreat. Whereas in a dictatorship, you could still retreat to a private space.
Right.
Is that what we're saying?
Right. This collapsing of the distinction between public and private, this striving for absolute transparency was a classic feature of how she was using this term totalitarianism. So that's where the term comes from. That's where the concept comes from.
But what was the first historical incarnation of a regime such as that? Is it with Nazi Germany? Is it with Stalin? Is it with Mussolini? Or is it way before that we already see some elements?
I would say it's profoundly modern. I think she would I think she would put Stalin first. And then Hitler and Mussolini as a more imperfect version. That Origins of Totalitarianism, which is still the book I go back to. It's a very thick book. It's hundreds of pages. I go back to again and again with my students, really goes through Nazism and Stalinism and tries to tease out the common elements and really looks at these existential variables like the destruction of subjectivity before physical death. What does it mean to get rid of personhood before you have actually physically annihilated something? And she makes a very controversial statement there, which is that before the Jews were led to the gas chambers, they were already dead. Their subjectivity had been killed as spontaneous agents. And she also makes the claim that this totalitarianism is ultimately striving to eradicate subjectivity, not only on the part of the victims, but also on the part of the perpetrators, so that ideally anyone is ideally suited for either role, and the distinction begins to be effaced.
Yeah, we're going to talk more about that later on. But I wanted to ask, what are some of the key sort of essential building blocks of a totalitarian regime? Things that absolutely must possess to be recognized as such. For example, is it necessary that it fosters a cult of personality or have an extensive secret police program, or that part of its ideology is predicated on hunting for internal enemies all the time? Or could it do without one of these or all of those?
Well, that's a good question. Social scientists then like to come up with lists, but in real life, you can't do a control study. You can only empirically describe the different elements. Certainly the role of the secret police is key. And classically, this situation in which everyone is potentially an agent provocateur of everybody else. Anyone can denounce anyone else at any time. So you
Some sort
create
of
this,
eternal inquisition program
yes,
happens.
and you create this climate of constant suspicion where the fabric of society is eroded by the fact that nobody can trust anybody else.
Wow, that
That's
sounds
why,
fun.
like,
Yeah.
she uses the phrase a lot, atomization, and that's something I've been coming back to a lot lately. The way in which these regimes use terror to foster atomization, so that
Mm.
everybody is isolated. Nobody knows who is going to be next. Everybody tries to retreat, and it erodes the possibility for solidarity, which is why, in some sense, the only possible antidote to that kind of atomization is solidarity, which is very hard to get to in a situation where everyone has been terrorized. And part of the terrorizing and this climate of everyone can denounce everybody else at every time is this arbitrariness, because you don't know who will be next, and that keeps everybody, in this state of insecurity. Which is one of the things there's a great word in Russian that we don't actually have in English, which you might have in either Slovenian or Croatian. You can tell me, which is proizvol, which is literally arbitrariness, kind of always already tinged with tyranny and the potential for terror. And it's the way in which this capriciousness, you could kind of use Willkür in German, already has a very dark side. And so you don't know, the secret police can come knock at anyone's door at any time, and you don't know who is going to be next. And that creates a situation of mass disempowerment and atomization in which the social ties that, ideally are present in society are eroded.
To say I'm particularly interested in those moments where things begin to spiral from the current system to a totalitarian one, like the tipping points, if they exist, so to speak.
Yeah.
And let's maybe take Germany, because Russia had a pretty brutal Tsarist regime before the revolution already, so it's complicated. But while Germans actually enjoyed at least a period of liberal democracy, the Weimar era, before the rise of the Nazis. But here's what I'm wondering: when Hitler begins to take over, are regular people instantly aware of this seismic shift for the worse, or do things seem gradual, almost organic to them? Because we must have a lot of like personal diaries or correspondences available from that time.
Yes. And for the most part, it's the latter, which is one of the things that's so scary. It's
Yeah.
the general rule is that it's step by step. Alexander von der Bellen here, that president in Austria, once said at one of the commemorations of Auschwitz, said, Auschwitz ist nicht von Himmel gefallen. Auschwitz did not fall from the sky. It's step by step by step. There's a very famous speech that Toni Morrison gives, I think at Howard University in 1995, where she talks about it. It's one step and then another and then another. And so the borders recede very gradually. And it's one of the tricks in a way, because people normalize the abnormal. And it's especially easy to do that when things are happening gradually. And that's traditionally been the way it's happened. People swallow one thing and then another thing and then another thing, and then before you know it, you're in this space you never could have imagined. And that's why it's so important to be vigilant.
Whew, bad news. So in the 1930s,
I know it's not very cheerful.
But necessary. So in the 1930s, we have, like you said, these two nightmarish totalitarian systems in Europe. We had Hitler's Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union. What are some of, if we're a little bit more concrete, what are some of the similarities and some of perhaps the differences between the two?
Well, you have a cult of a leader. You have a search for scapegoats. You have demands for certain kinds of unconditional loyalty. You have interesting things happening with language and the way that public language is manipulated. You have terror. Now, I mean, I find Stalinism kind of intellectually a much more interesting phenomenon than Nazism. I mean, in some sense, in Nazism, the line between, who is the scapegoat and who is part of the chosen class, is much more stable. You may be eroding the subjectivity, of those guards in the camps. But if you're an Aryan or a non-Aryan. There's that famous movie you may have seen, Untergang, that's
Yeah, of
based
course.
on,
Yeah.
right, the diary of
Yeah, yeah,
Hitler's
yeah.
secretary, a fictionalized version of that. But you see in
Traudl
his
Junge.
last,
Yeah.
yes, I mean, you see in those last days of the bunker that the people who are around him do feel that they are part of this chosen class and chosen group, and that he's not about to turn on them. And that was not true under Stalin. There really, really was no safe space and no position under Stalin. Because whoever was the leading Bolshevik, or the most important second party member could be declared an enemy of the people who had always been a spy and saboteur and working for the bourgeoisie the next moment. And so there really was no safe space. The way in which the party turns against itself during the Stalinist purges is quite distinct, I think, from anything that happens under Nazism. And it's much more complex in that sense. And also there's something quite primitive about the idea of saying that, we are the chosen people, and these other people who are of some other racial category, we're going to scapegoat them, we're going to purge them. But the categories of the people being purged under Stalinism and the attempts to create a utopian world based on these purified people, which was not necessarily racially based at all. I think it's psychologically more complex, and I think it's intellectually more complex. And one of the things that I remember hearing back in the 90s when the Communist Party archives were opening, which is when I became a historian, was some of the older people in the field said, well, we find out that the big secret about the communist that we learned from opening the Communist Party archives is that they really were communist. They really did believe, that they were going to build this future, and they were willing to make all sorts of sacrifices for it.
Even when, for example, after Stalin is gone and then Khrushchev takes over and he's denouncing Stalin, aren't these fellas saying, like, maybe the system we've created is pretty monstrous? Like, why wasn't, when there was the chance of this kind of a break with when Stalin died, nobody kind of did any sort of, I don't know, cleaning of the closet of sorts?
Well, there was 3 years, right? There were 3 years between Stalin's death in March 1953 and Khrushchev's secret speech in February 1956. The question of why it took those 3 years is another question, and the question of when does Stalinism end? Does it end in March 1953? Does it end in February 1956? Remains an open question. But that speech, there are a few moments in history that had the electrifying, tearing effect of Khrushchev's speech. And people really were devastated. People really felt like, Boleslav Beirut, has some kind of heart attack or mental breakdown or physical breakdown and never comes back to Poland. He dies some 10 days after that speech in Moscow. But the sense of what it did and the devastation that one of the things I read through years and years ago was the Czechoslovak Writers Union was forced to have a meeting in the wake of Khrushchev's secret speech to discuss these revelations. And these writers were traumatized, and people stood up there and said, listen, my generation, we grew up with Stalin's name. And my best friends, they went to their deaths in the Nazi camps with Stalin's name on their lips. And now you're telling me, well, no, I'm not going to apologize. I'm not ashamed. I mean, I can also say that just as recently as 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, the Russian Communist Party, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, officially declared that Khrushchev's secret speech was erroneous, and based on historical prejudice, and they are trying officially now and formally to rehabilitate Stalin. And this is happening in Russia, where arguably, they bear the most responsibility for Stalin, but also they were at the center of the people who were victimized by Stalin. So there's a sadomasochistic element to this.
Okay, I'm sorry, but we do back to Stalinism. We have to talk about the purges because this must be one of the most grotesque chapters in 20th century history, and I'm still struggling to understand why people, and especially people in Stalin's inner circle, fellow communists, basically just sat around twiddling their thumbs, waiting for their turn, even though they knew fully well, like you said, there might be a knock at the door and they're going to be up next. They're usually along with their families. I mean, how did that work?
It really is that heart of darkness at the very essence of the Stalinist experience that many, many historians have torn their hair out trying to understand how people were broken in such a way. And there are, history is always both overdetermined and underdetermined. I mean, in individual cases, you could see certain factors working. They used torture. They used terror. They used essentially holding threats against somebody's family against them. You can get people to confess to a lot if you torture them, if you threaten to torture their children. In that sense, it's not such a mystery. But the other thing is that these die-hard Bolsheviks, they're part of it was a sense of, if this is what the party needs from me to take the blame for X or Y, I am prepared to do whatever the party needs for me. That played a role. These people who absolutely had devoted their lives to this project. And the sense that if it has all gone wrong, if this was all some kind of a grotesque mistake, if we have really led humanity not to liberation, but to terror, then how can I go on living at all? Then what is the point? Then I've given my life for something truly evil. I mean, this
So
is
it's
what
best
you
that
see.
I carry on instead of potentially uncovering that we've all made like a colossal mistake.
Yeah, or that I allow myself to be sacrificed,
Mm.
or that there were quite a lot of suicides as well. But this is what you see in like Arthur Kessler's Darkness at Noon. There's
I
a
haven't read
very
it.
good,
I have it on my to read list. Yeah. It's about show
that
trials,
is,
right?
that's the classic account. I mean, it's really based above all on the Bukharin trial in Moscow. And Bukharin's confession at the end, in which he's embracing his own guilt and he's embracing the fact that he's about to be executed. Uh, Another story I can tell you is that when the Rudolf Slansky and his co-conspirators, all of these high-ranking communists, 14 of them, were put on trial in Prague in 1952. Um, Otto Katz gets up there and gives a closing speech that is taken almost verbatim from Kessler's Darkness at Noon. And Kessler took it from Bukharin's confession in the 1930s. So it was too fantastic to be believed, in Moscow in the 1930s. Kessler exposes it in the meantime in this novel that millions of people read. Otto Katz spits it back out in Prague in 1952, and they buy it and they hang him. And it's an extraordinary story. In fact, the French director Ruth Silberman recently, a few years ago, 2022, 2021, made a documentary film about the Slansky trial using very newly discovered footage from the trial. And it's fantastically good. It's definitely worth seeing, and trying to figure out, how did these people confess? How do you get these people to confess? And how do you get a whole population to believe in it? At the time of the Slansky trial, all of the newspapers splattered across the front page, death to the fascists, death to the imperialist, the workers demand death, death, death. It's this orgy of bloodlust.
By the way, if we backtrack just a little bit, because I'm not too familiar with Bukharin's case, how did one, perhaps, if we stay with him, how did one fell out of favor with the regime?
Very easily,
Was
because
that?
it was
Yeah.
largely arbitrary. And that's
Okay.
it,
So
it.
it didn't take
It
much.
just,
You didn't have to like
no,
pelt Stalin with eggs to be
no,
denounced and then arrested.
no. By the height of the terror, you didn't have to do anything. You didn't have to make a critical remark. But one of the things that, one of the characteristics is that because anyone could denounce anyone at any time, everyone was both infinitely powerful and infinitely vulnerable. You want the apartment of the person next door? Well, you might mention that you thought that person was rolling his eyes when there was a mention of Stalin. But somebody could do the same thing to you. And so that spirals. There's also this sense of contagion. Somebody gets arrested, and then anyone who has any association with them gets arrested. There's, one of the things I'm going to make students read this year is some passages from Nadezhda Mandelstam's extraordinary memoir, which is a book everybody should read, Hope Against Hope. And she talks about their protocols when Osip Mandelstam, her husband, gets arrested, and Anna Hakhmatova's son comes over that morning, and she says immediately, Osip got arrested, go away. She said, we have a protocol. When somebody gets arrested, everybody immediately goes as far away as possible because any kind of contact can be a contagion. And because of this contagiousness, everything spreads. There was no safe space of any line to stand on, which I think was different in Nazi Germany. I think you did have a choice. I think to be on a good side of Hitler, to know what you had to do and what you had to say. And that was just not true in the Stalinist terror. There was absolutely no safe space. And Molotov, they purge his wife, and he remains loyal.
Yeah, I remember that. But then it was completely arbitrary. How did you get selected, so to speak, by this rotisserie of death? I mean, probably wasn't a good idea to be close to Stalin. That much is certain, right?
Yeah, certainly the party was turning against itself. I think it was more dangerous in the cities. But then there was also a huge amount of arbitrariness involved.
Another question I believe is always worth asking here is how do ordinary people end up becoming, like you said, not just believers, but henchmen who are enacting these massive crimes within the regimes? And since you've clearly studied the work of Hannah Arendt extensively, perhaps we could illustrate this with the example of Adolf Eichmann, the notorious SS officer who helped organize the Holocaust and who she wrote about in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem.
Now, this is another topic I've been going back to a lot lately. In fact, I was just in Kiev at the Kiev Book Arsenal, and my brilliant philosopher colleague Volodymyr Yermolenko and I had a public discussion precisely about Hannah Arendt and the problem of evil. And to what extent can Arendt's model of Eichmann and the banality of evil be extended? So for your viewers who haven't read and reread obsessively the Eichmann book, as I have, I just say a little bit about this. So Adolf Eichmann was the organizer of the final solution to kill all the Jews in Europe. He was not the theoretician. He was not the ideologue. He was the very practical organizer who figured out which trains were going where and how you were going to get these people to that camp and those people to this other camp. He was basically a bureaucrat. After the war, he escaped. He fled to Argentina. He was living under an assumed name. The Israeli Mossad, the Israeli secret police, pursued him for years and years. They finally catch him in Argentina, 1960, 1961, something like that, and illegally kidnap him and bring him back to Jerusalem to stand trial. And he is put on essentially on show trial, as not just an example of revenge or vindication or just punishment, but also as a pedagogical exercise, as a lesson in teaching a new generation of Israelis what happened during the Holocaust. It was really a moment of breaking open what had been a very long silence, about what had happened. And so person after person and all of these survivors who had ended up in Israel got up to testify. The three Israeli judges were all native German speakers, which was important because they were listening to Eichmann in his own language. Hannah Arendt, who was in the United States, is sent by the New Yorker to cover that trial. She flies to Jerusalem. She's also listening in her native language. I thought of this, by the way, years later when Slavenka Drakulic went to The Hague to listen to the war crimes trials of the Yugoslav war criminals, because it was significant that she was listening in her own language and not through the translator. So Hannah Arendt goes and she's listening to Eichmann. And what completely shocks her is the discrepancy between the sheer monstrosity of what this person has done and the total mediocrity of his person.
Not the most charismatic guy out there has to be said.
No, he wasn't charismatic at all. I mean, he was, he was, defensive. He was self-justifying, but he was basically a kind of middle range bureaucrat who was not particularly bright. She said every sentence he uttered sounded like a cliche. He was incapable of really thinking for himself in any kind of critical way of coming up with his own language. And she said his inability to talk struck me as being part of an inability to think, and namely to think from the point of view of somebody else. But what struck her is that this man was not a monster. He wasn't motivated by hate or by lust or by any kind of demonic evil. He was basically an opportunistic bureaucrat, from his point of view, trying to perform his duties very diligently and as well and as enthusiastic as possible, in the hopes that he would be promoted. And his defense is, well, the loyal subjects of good regimes are lucky. The loyal, hardworking subjects of bad regimes are unlucky. I was a loyal, hardworking subject of a bad regime. I happen to be unlucky. Yeah. And of course, people who, are bureaucrats who would like to be promoted, move up, who are trying to do their work conscientiously in order for there to be some kind of social mobility or career gain, that's a very ordinary thing. So how does this very ordinary thing, land us in Auschwitz? And that's the question she's asking. How is that the total banality of his motives, the ordinariness, the fact that you want to see in this man a demon, and he's really just a kind of pathetic clown. What does that mean for how we understand evil?
And what was the answer that she came up with?
Her answer is that ultimately, well, there are two answers. Her answer is that ultimately only goodness really has depth. And there's something very thin about evil. But the other answer, which she develops further in Life of the Mind, she says that is there something about the faculty of thinking as such that is connected to being able to make moral distinctions? And maybe the greatest crime is a failure to think. I think people completely misinterpreted this book. They hated Arendt for this. They felt like she was trying to exculpate Eichmann and saying, oh, he wasn't such a bad guy. But that was a misunderstanding. For Arendt, Eichmann's crime was not that he hated Jews, but that he failed to think. He failed to think for himself. And that for her, that did not make him better than other criminals. If anything, that made him worse, because the greatest failure is the failure to think. And she really comes up with this. There's something about thinking as such that is the moral imperative. There is never an excuse for not thinking. And there is no substitute for a population who knows how to think.
Oof, especially relevant with the advent of AI and ChatGPT.
Incredibly relevant. It is absolutely on point. One of the things I keep coming back to is after February 2022, of course, everybody was asking obsessively, what are Russians really thinking? What are Russians really thinking? What is going on? And an interviewer asked Masha Gessen this question, and they answered, which I think was the best answer I've yet heard, and still feels unsatisfying, but is the one that's most on point. They said, it's very hard to determine what people are really thinking in a totalitarian society, because the whole point of a totalitarian regime is to prevent people from thinking as such. And I think that is a key. I think Arendt was on to something. Like, there is never an excuse for failure to think. And Eichmann simply wasn't thinking. He didn't see it as his job to think. He saw it as his job to perform the duties as they were given to him.
By the way, in a totalitarian state, how much is the whole thing driven by, let's say, deeper, more structural forces, with the leader on top more of a figurehead and possibly replaceable, and how much is it, in fact, an extension of a particular dictator's personality? I guess I'm asking, if we had someone other than Hitler at the top of the Third Reich, or another apparatchik guy ruling the Soviet Union, let's say Trotsky instead of Stalin, would these two regimes still be essentially the same or not?
This is a classic historical question, which of course we can't actually answer because we can't do a control study on real life. But it's an excellent question because it's one we've come back to again and again and again. What if Lenin had lived? What if Trotsky had won the power struggle? What if Hitler had been accepted at that art school in Vienna? What if? We don't know, because you can't do a control study in real life. You can't go back and run the same scene again, holding certain variables constant in the interest of figuring out which variables were actually causal. I mean, I tend to think there's an enormous amount of contingency involved. I think it's very possible, that if Hitler had been accepted into art school in Vienna, this would not have happened. I think if anything happens to that sealed German train car that Lenin was on in spring of 1917, being whisked by the Germans from Switzerland to Petrograd, I think anything happens to that sealed German train car and Lenin does not get to Petrograd in April 1917. And I think arguably there's no Bolshevik revolution, and the whole 20th century as we know it plays out totally differently.
Okay, I recently interviewed historian Timothy Ryback on his book Takeover: Hitler's Final Rise to Power, and towards the end of the conversation, he made some startling comparisons between the events described in his book and what's going on in the US these days. I don't believe I nudged him towards mentioning Donald Trump, but he did. As a historian of totalitarianism, where do you see some of the parallels between the regimes we discussed and MAGA of today?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely terrifying. I mean, I see both similarities and differences. But one of the problems of being a historian is that history doesn't tell you what will happen, but it gives you a sense of what can happen. The possibilities are generally much more capacious than we imagine them to be. And once you know what can happen, you can't unknow that. There's no way to unknow that. Like, what the possibilities are, and they're very dark. And you also know that a combination of certain kinds of charismatic personalities plus underlying structural conditions can exploit vulnerabilities that are inherent in the human condition. And I certainly see that with Donald Trump. I see the use of terror. I see the use of arbitrariness. I see the way in which he sends out ICE like the Gestapo. And you don't know who will be next because there's no more rule of law. You don't know what student's going to be taken off the street. I'm a professor, and I've now just, as of very recently, I've left Yale and I'm teaching at University of Toronto. But all last year when I was on leave from Yale, I was going back and forth to New Haven, and among other things, I was meeting with my advisees there, who I will continue to advise. I would never just drop my graduate students. Many of our students are foreign students. At a big university like Yale or Harvard, it's probably around 25%. In a field like mine in East European history, it's probably closer to 40%. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm sitting at a coffee shop. We're talking about someone's thesis. We're talking about a dissertation. What would I do if guys in masks come and try to take that person away? Would I fight with them? Would I be brave? Would I try to pull the mask off? Would I be paralyzed? Would I say nothing? Would I start crying? Would I scream? Would I call for help? You don't know. You don't know who's going to be next, and you don't know how you're going to react. My brother, who is a professor of music in Boston, his students it's probably closer to 40% too of foreign students. I mean, people from all over the world come to these elite music conservatories. And one of the first things he posted on Facebook at the time of the inauguration was, okay, crowdsourcing assistance. What do I do if ICE comes into my classroom and tries to take one of my students? How do I model courage? How do I model integrity? How can I protect my students? And the fact is, nobody knows, because you don't know who's going to be next. And that is a classic, how that terror works, the atomization, the way that people start shutting up and getting in line, that you can see happening very, very quickly. You can see the gathering around the leader. You can see the use of terror. You can see the way people start making small compromises. Right around the time of the election, J.D. Vance tweeted that my husband, Tim Snyder, who was also a professor at Yale until we both left for the Munk School very recently, he sent out a tweet saying, Tim Snyder is an embarrassment to Yale. Now, I didn't for a moment suspect that our colleagues, were more sympathetic to Vance than to Tim. I was quite sure that I understood where they stood, but nobody publicly spoke up for him, including all of our colleagues in the law school who, in my opinion, bear some responsibility for the creation and promotion of J.D.
That's
Vance.
crazy.
And that terrified me because I thought, okay, that's how it starts.
I'm curious about your opinion on the ideological sort of conundrum MAGA represents, but it seems that, Hitler and Stalin had broader, more well-defined ideologies propelling them, not so much with Trump. I don't know if you've seen the film, but I'm a big fan of the film The Big Lebowski. It's this sort of dark comedy by the Coen brothers. There's this fantastic line by one of the characters who is talking about the nihilists, who are some sort of quasi-antagonists in the movie. And he says, I mean, say what you want about the tenets of National Socialism, dude, at least it's an ethos. Because Trump, on the other hand, does seem like a nihilist, a totally empty shell, more like a con man willing to do and say anything to keep himself in the limelight and in power. What's your take here?
This, to me, has been the single most provocative distinction, I would say, between the totalitarianisms of the 20th century and what we're getting in the 21st century with Putinism and Trumpism. This kind of postmodern nihilist version. Because one of the things Arendt would say, you see, I'm a big Arendtian, I keep going back to Arendt, was that one of the advantages that these big totalitarian political lies have, one of the advantages that ideology has, is that even though it's false, it can be much more logical and consistent than actual reality. Because the problem with reality is that reality is permeated by arbitrariness. That facts, empirical facts, always bear the vulnerability of their original contingency. The fact that Germany invades Belgium in 1914, that's not a law of physics that made that happen. You can imagine a world in which something else might much more reasonably have happened. And so ideologies can make everything examples of consistent laws, and they can make the world much more coherent, and pointing in a teleological direction than it actually is. And that's a huge advantage that these ideologies had. They make everything make sense. They edit out the arbitrariness and the inconsistency, and they give everything a direction. Now, what is perversely fascinating to me at the moment is that we're no longer in that world. Now for both Putin and Trump, there's not even an attempt to be consistent. You change your mind one day, 1 hour after another hour. I mean, you've seen how Trump fluctuates radically, whether it's arms for Ukraine or tariffs for Canada, or whether or not he's going to release the Epstein files or what the Epstein files are, whatever it is, there's absolutely no attempt to weave a consistent story, and to even give people some kind of vision of where they're going and that it has a certain direction. It's just this laying bare of nihilism. It's just this naked reign of nihilism, and unmitigated narcissism. And it's been much more this post-truth form of whether we can call it neo-fascism, we can call it neo-totalitarianism, whatever we choose to try to kind of create some concept for this postmodern variation. It's much more about undermining the idea that there is anything such as directionality and truth and coherence, as it is about providing people with a kind of directionality and truth and coherence. In this sense, we really are in new territory, and that the technological possibilities for throwing out one story after another story after another story and disseminating them on this massive, massive level had not previously in human history existed.
I mean, but I still kind of don't understand, because this is a guy who's selling golden sneakers and cryptocurrency scams and saying, I have the best words and stuff like this. How is this particular person making it all stand together? Just seems pretty crazy.
Yeah, no, it is pretty crazy. I mean, there are a couple things. One, I think there is something very visceral that appeals to certain people, which I fundamentally don't understand because I have such a visceral sense of disgust that I can't even stand to listen to him. When I have to watch clips, I try to watch the subtitled version so I don't have to hear his voice because it makes me feel physically sick. But clearly other people have precisely, the opposite reaction. There's something very visceral. The only thing that I really see that makes sense to me as a historian is this idea of authenticity or honesty. And when people say that, well, he feels real to me, it doesn't mean, of course, that there's a correspondence between what he says and empirical reality, because we know there is no such correspondence. The joke that the parody, that satire that the New Yorker published back in 2015, early 2016, was the fact checker who passes out from exhaustion at the end of the Republican primary debates, because nobody can, there's just a total unhinging from empirical reality. But what people are seeing and they identify as authenticity or honesty, would be what Freud would call the free expression of eros and thanatos. So I don't think we can find this in the political scientist. I think we've got to go back to psychoanalysis. And Freud says eros and thanatos, lust, and a drive for destruction and violence and aggression, the fact that we want to rape and kill one another all the time. Freud says that's just hardwired. It's part of the human condition. Civilization, Freud says, is about repressing those desires to rape and kill one another all the time. And therefore, he says, civilization is bound to make us unhappy because it involves repression. Now, he said, liberation from that repression, which is what Trump is offering. Now, if you see a woman walking down the street and you want to rape her, go ahead, say that aloud. That's perfectly okay. Freud would say that is authentic liberation. And for that, we pay only the small price of the destruction of civilization. And we are paying that price of the destruction of civilization. But I think that is the deep appeal of Trump, that kind of liberation. Now, all of that lust and anger and aggression is given free rein. And it's true. Civilization is based on repression. We might get furious at someone who cuts us off in traffic. But there are good reasons why we shouldn't take out a gun and shoot that person. There are good reasons why we should repress various things in order to live together.
I listened to an interview of yours where you used the phrase post-truth, postmodern totalitarianism. That's fascinating. What exactly did you mean by that?
That the idea is less to instill in the minds of one's followers a coherent ideology and more to undermine the notion that there is such a thing as truth at all. So Stalin, for instance, was very good at mobilizing people, into kinds of fanatical devotions, and willingness to engage and declare their faith and their loyalty and their excitement about the coming of the communist utopia, blah, blah, blah. Putinism is much better at demobilizing people than at mobilizing them. And if, when we actually do get some intelligence coming from Russia, you see people saying, well, what do you think about X or Y? And the answer is, nie interesuje polityka. I'm not interested in politics. I stay out of that, and everything, what you get day after day is a sense of, well, on the one hand, on the other hand, you have your facts, I have alternative facts. And I can give you an example of this that struck me at the very beginnings of the war in the Donbass. So at the beginnings of the war in the Donbass, Putin was saying there are no Russian soldiers in the Donbass. This is local, this is a civil war. These are people who have been oppressed by the CIA-sponsored Ukrainian Nazis in Kiev, who are blah, blah, blah. And then there's an episode of the Russian propaganda channel RT that is in English, that is designed for foreign consumption. There's some 25-year-old approximately host there, who, with a little bit of Russian, who is hosting this episode, and ostensibly in the Donbass. We don't know where he really was, but let's just say he was there. And he says, and the episode opens like, today we're here to investigate whether there are really Russian soldiers in the Donbass. We know this is a big question. Lots of people are interested, so I'm here to help you find out. okay, let's like, here we are in this town. Let's walk down the street and see who we can find. Oh, look, there are some guys over there in camouflage. Let's figure out who they are. Like moseys over to them, like, Здравствуйте, привет, привет, vi Ruski, like, are you Russians? They're shaking their head. They're like, no, I'm kind of I'm local. I live over here. I live over there. And he's like, I don't know, these guys don't seem to be Russians, but let's walk down another street. Like, look, there are some more guys who seem to be in camouflage. Let's see if we can figure out where they're from. You would never get this during Stalinism. There would be one very clear line that everyone was supposed to be fanatically devoted to. But at the end of this episode, you're like, well, I don't know. He didn't seem to run into anyone who said they were from Russia, but these guys were from here, these guys were from there. Who knows who they are really? And you kind of give up on the idea that there really is such a thing as truth and that it's even worth your time to try to figure it out. So this undermining of the notion that there is an empirical reality that acts as a kind of constraint, is at the center of this postmodern version. And that's true for both Trump and it's true for Putinism, and it's new territory. And of course it's a very dark side of postmodernism, which originally developed as an outgrowth of the critical sensibility of the left and a desire never again to fall prey to the absolutist narratives that gave us Nazism and Stalinism. And now it's come back to bite us. And the key figures there, you really have to go back to the 1990s and look at the role of Gleb Pavlovsky and Vladislav Surkov, who were really the postmodern, spin doctor masterminds of this.
That's interesting because contemporary kind of conservative ideologues, people such as Jordan Peterson, usually accuse the left of being completely, total postmodernists and stuff, like having no values and just like making a mockery of reality. But in reality, what you're saying is it's pretty much the other way around, if I understood you correctly.
It very much develops from the critical sensibility of the left, but then it's kind of turned around and used as a weapon from the right. And this is the thing about the history of ideas, right? The person who first articulates X doesn't get a monopoly on its interpretation. Once ideas are out there, they move, they take on new forms. And one of the interesting things, I was talking to Ivan Krastev about this, is that there was a kind of delay before all this, Derrida and Foucault and all this French post-structuralism really makes its way into Russia en masse. It's the 1990s, and these are things that are developing through late 60s, 70s, and 80s. And one of the intellectual history arguments you get about the Russian Empire comes from Isaiah Berlin, who makes a very strong argument that the fatal intellectual philosophical import into the Russian Empire was not Marxism, but Hegelianism. And Isaiah Berlin's argument is kind of like, okay, a little like you give some Hegel to the Germans. It might have been one thing for the Germans. You give some Hegel to the Russians, they just get drunk on him and they never come back. And the way in which Russian intellectuals took to Hegel, he feels was the fatal moment. There's some very interesting material about this. I'm a big fan of Isaiah Berlin, who himself is a native Russian speaker coming from Riga. Alexander Herzen writes in his memoirs that, the phenomenology of spirit, that's not a book you read, it's an experience. You live through the phenomenology of spirit. But the idea that Hegel comes relatively late, decades after he's already been absorbed in Germany, to the Russian Empire. But then the Russians kind of get drunk on him. And one could make a similar argument about, say, French post-structuralism. It comes into Russia late, but then they kind of go off the deep end. And the idea that nothing is true, and everything is a game, and a whole society can be designed in which nothing is true and everything is a game. And this was the evil genius of Vladislav Surkov.
Do you think Stalin read Hegel?
Do I think Stalin read Hegel? I think he probably did read some Hegel. How much Hegel he understood, I'm not sure. I think certainly Bukharin did. A lot of these guys did. People, you have all these accounts of Bolsheviks, like some of them, they get purged, they end up in prison, they spend their time in prison studying Hegel. It was not a joke, and people read Hegel very, very seriously. Especially these hardcore Bolsheviks. Now, I mean, the thing about getting drunk on Hegel is incredibly difficult. When I teach
I
Hegel to
tried
my
and I
students,
failed.
yeah. Right. It's like it's amazing that a book that seduced so many people, how do you even get through the first three sentences?
I can't go back. I'm never going to go back. I've already made this decision, unfortunately.
Well, if you do go back, and for the benefit of your listeners, the
Yeah.
breakthrough for me was listening to Jay Bernstein's lectures on Hegel, which are fantastic. Jay Bernstein is a professor, philosopher at the New School, New York. He teaches a year-long lecture course on phenomenology of spirit. He goes through paragraph by paragraph. He's a fantastically entertaining lecturer with a great sense of humor, and years ago, I listened to that whole lecture course, and that was when things really came together for me. So for any of your listeners who want to commune with Hegel, it's free. It's on the internet. I think it's called the Bernstein tapes. His students recorded and put them up there. You can read along with Jay's lectures.
Okay, cool. Because I was about to wait for some sort of a comic book edition. They're turning everything into comic books now. Like I've just seen like Rosa Luxemburg's life in a comic book and stuff. So I was like, oh, maybe they're gonna make Hegel once, and that's when I'm gonna go back. But that sounds lovely.
Rosa Luxemburg definitely read Hegel.
Yeah, I can imagine. Professor, back to what's happening in the States today. You obviously believe what you say because, like you already mentioned, you recently made headlines when you announced that you are uprooting your family and, despite your fruitful career as an academic, moving from the US to Canada. What was the final nail in the coffin that made you take this drastic step?
I mean, it was, well, the first thing I should say is it's really not such a drastic move. What totally blew me away is that like a handful of middle-aged academics go from one very good university to another very good university, which is the most boring, ordinary, banal thing. And this actually makes international news, which kind of stunned me. And I then
that New
spent
York
all this
Times
time.
video has like 3 million views when all three of you are getting interviewed. Those
I
are
know
like
it's
Justin
completely
Bieber
crazy.
numbers. Yeah.
It's completely crazy. I mean, it was well for Jason Stanley, for our friend Jason really did make the decision after the inauguration when Columbia capitulated and he panicked. For me and my husband, I think we were inclined to take these offers anyway. I wanted to get the kids away from the gun violence in the States, which is something I'd wanted for a long time. And there are reasons why, the Munk School in Toronto is a particularly attractive place. I mean, among other things, it's not only interdisciplinary, but it was created by this extraordinary political scientist, Janice Stein, who is a force of nature, as a space that would cultivate academic scholarship that was simultaneously publicly engaged and public facing, which is not something that is taken for granted at universities, including and sometimes especially, at the most elite universities, because, often we feel that the purity of what we do is dependent on being in a kind of ivory tower and not letting ourselves be unduly influenced or affected by what's going on around us, that we're supposed to be writing scholarship, that is for other scholars and that is at the highest level. And I'm sympathetic to that in various ways. I also feel, as somebody who is a historian of totalitarianism in Eastern Europe, as someone who is a Slavicist who has been very engaged my whole adult life with Eastern Europe, and now my friends and colleagues are being slaughtered in Ukraine, I do not feel it's been a moment, certainly for the past decade or so, that I can disengage from the world around me and pretend that I am above that or apart from that or not letting myself be touched by it. It's not a time when I feel that I'm not going to write for a public audience because that involves dumbing things down. I feel like it's a time where I feel, an enormous, moral imperative to be engaged on behalf of Ukraine. I also feel a moral imperative to be engaged on behalf of what's happening in my own country, which I've just left. And so the idea of a school, of an institute within a great university that's specifically kind of promoting and supporting that was very appealing to me. So that was the first thing. But then after the election, I absolutely did not want to bring my kids back to this because I knew that we were about to spiral into a reign of terror. I fear we're heading to a civil war. I hope I'm wrong. I would love to be wrong. Um, but I did feel like this is not where I want my kids spending their teenage years. And I feel guilty about that. I feel like there's certainly an opportunism in that. Like I want them someplace safer to the extent that's possible. But the other thing that shocked me about this story, I would say, especially with respect to the Europeans, is that I then gave interview after interview to these very smart European journalists who were asking me these questions like, but you don't really think that this could happen in America, or you don't really think things could get that bad in America, or surely it couldn't go that far in America. And I felt like, do you really need this silly story about these middle-aged academics going to a different university to shake you into seeing what is right in front of you? I have no secret privileged information that other journalists, or other writers don't have. We're all watching this play out in real time. And I felt like a Freudian psychoanalyst trying to coax people out of this Freudian denial that what they were seeing, they were actually seeing. And I thought that's very curious because so often I feel in Europe that, from the point of view of the Europeans, maybe especially the Germans, America is a barbaric country. We have a culture industry. We have a cultural industry. We don't have real culture. And to a certain extent, these criticisms are fair, but underlying that, there is still this sense, which I think I had not fully appreciated before. But after all, you are the land of the free and the home of the brave. But really, things could fall apart everywhere else, but not in America. My colleague, my historian colleague, Vlado Petrovic, who's from Serbia, wrote a great piece recently in Eurozine. And he's like, my dear reader, yes, it could happen here. It could happen there. It could happen anywhere. It could happen wherever you happen to be.
Good old European snobism coupled with the fact that we've watched Independence Day one too many times, where America always saves the day and is the most stable place on earth. But you mentioned that America might spiral into civil war. So I just have to ask you about that. Where do you see this manifesting? Because this is pretty, for a European, again, this is a pretty shocking statement.
Yeah. Well, I see it manifesting in various ways. One of which is that Trump is clearly playing with the politics of provocatia, and this is another word that we have in English, but it doesn't exactly have the same oomph that it has in Slavic languages. Provocation as not just an inspiration or an impetus, but as a complex game or a setup, in which certain groups are set up so that they can then be turned against other groups, or through that violence that might otherwise, or anger that might be directed against the government, is redirected somewhere else. One of the things that scared me when they took away Mahmoud Khalil, the pro-Palestinian Columbia student protester, with no due process, they just take him from his apartment, throw him in this prison for an indefinite length of time in Louisiana. His wife is about to give birth. Ostensibly because they are protecting Jewish students from anti-Semitism. And I rarely engage publicly as a Jew, but in this case, I did sign an open letter by Jewish faculty members from all different universities called Not in Our Name, saying, if we allow this cynical, disingenuous pretext of protecting Jews from anti-Semitism to be used as an excuse for abusing the rights of other people, we have morally bankrupted ourselves. Moreover, I could already see in my, slightly paranoid, perhaps East Europeanist way, the possibility that this regime cynically uses, well, we need to protect Jews from anti-Semitism as a pretext for abusing other people's rights. And then the justifiable anger of people whose rights are abused can then be redirected against the Jews. Which there's nothing this regime would relish more than seeing that anger redirected against other people. So there's a lot of provocation, sending the Marines, sending the National Guard into Los Angeles unnecessarily. It's a provocation. You're going to create more violence. Also a permissiveness for political violence. All of those January 6th insurrectionaries, who violently stormed the Capitol building, being pardoned. On the morning of the All Kings protest, just last month, was it? There was a political assassination an attempted political assassination of 4 Democrats in Minnesota. 2 of them were actually killed. I think 2 of them are now recovering. So a permissiveness from the highest issue of government for political violence, attempts at provocation, and then you overlay that on a very heavily armed population. I think Europeans often fail to appreciate the extent of guns and gun violence.
We appreciate it. Yeah.
So you have to think about all of the political violence, the instigation, the provocation, and this is being laid on top of a population that is already heavily armed, in which there is already a lot of, so-called ordinary, everyday, non-political violence. In New Haven, where Yale is, if you end up in the emergency room, or if you break your arm or something on a Saturday night, everyone else has been shot. And there are police there, and people are screaming, and people are being tied to beds, and people are threatening the nurses. Yale has a security app, in which every time there's a shooting in New Haven, you get a little message saying there's been a shooting at this corner. Please avoid the area while police investigate. And we get these all the time.
And here's me in Japan, where the most dangerous object in a 5-kilometer radius is a baguette from the 7-Eleven convenience store.
It's a good reason to be in Japan.
Yeah, I'm not complaining. All right, Professor, so far, I think it's fair to say that things are looking a little bit grim out there, but we still have some wiggle room here. What would you say is the most effective guardrail against totalitarianism?
The only real guardrail the only real antidote to atomization is solidarity, which is very, very hard when people are terrorized. But you really need people to continue to speak up on behalf of other people, and especially on behalf of those who are most vulnerable. I had never really been so explicitly engaged in American politics as I have been since Trump came on the scene. I'm American, but I'm not an Americanist in the sense of my expertise is not actually in American politics. But in some sense, all the more so because, I'm talking to you now from Vienna, but, in principle, I'm now going to go back to Toronto in September. I feel all the more so obliged to speak up, on behalf of my fellow Americans who are in more vulnerable positions. And I should also say that it's not the case that there is no resistance. The structural checks and balances are breaking down, and they're breaking down quickly. They're breaking down violently because the Supreme Court has been bankrupted by being stacked with Trump's people, and because the lower courts, which have by and large been doing their jobs, and they've been issuing rulings saying you have to bring this person back. You can't actually deport this person to this prison in El Salvador. And the Trump administration has essentially been saying, fuck you, we're not going to do it. And that's sui generis territory. We've never been in that situation. What happens when the executive branch refuses to respect the judicial branch? But that said, there are definitely people, both in Washington, both Democratic members of Congress, and ordinary people who have been resisting, and that should be acknowledged, and they should get support. One project I've been involved in starting up is a website called Small Acts of Democratic Resistance, in which we're just starting to simply document, acts of democratic resistance, even if they be very local and on a small scale, just as a platform for mutual recognition, for solidarity, and potentially as a resource for foreign journalists.
Last question. Another ungrateful task. I know historians are not big fans of counterfactuals, but how do you think future historians are going to look at this period we're living through right now?
That's a good question. What's hard to imagine is how the technological changes will evolve. Certain kinds of vulnerabilities of people to being taken in by leaders, of having their resentments and grievances directed against scapegoats, those play out again and again in history. The idea that, okay, you're having a hard time. Well, it's because of these people. We're going to deport them. We're going to get rid of them. We're going to throw them in prison. That is a very old mechanism. That we can predict as part of the human condition. But the ways in which troll factories are churning out algorithms, to plant insane stories and, manipulate people's minds, that is very, very new territory. And I can't imagine how the combination of the new technology with the hardwired aspects of the human condition, that is what I can't figure out. I mean, I think historians will look back and say, couldn't they have given all the information they had? I mean, one thing that is really different, is the way in which we know everything in real time. And this is also an aspect of this postmodern neo-totalitarianism. In Russian, you would say obnaženia, the laying bare. Now we're seeing it all in real time. Putin and Trump really aren't even pretending, to not be, the sadistic lunatics that they are. I mean, not only do you have this egregious, open disregarding of the value of other people's lives, but now we have performative reveling in statism, and it is not hidden. Like, if people remember what Jan Karski, the Polish underground courier, what he went through to bring news of the Holocaust to the West, during the German occupation of Poland, it was this heroic effort. He was tortured by the Gestapo. He had teeth removed. He had a microfilm in his tooth. He gets to London. People don't believe him. He goes to Washington. People don't want to believe him there either. Just to bring news to the world of what's happening. He went through incredible lengths, and it took a long time for that information to penetrate. Now we're watching it all live streamed. Now we see the kids being buried under rubble in real time. Now everyone sees everything in real time, and how that impacts on how this watching all of this atrocity live stream impacts on the human psyche is something we haven't yet had time to absorb.
Unfortunately, it seems that most people just get numb, not spurned into action.
I worry about this, right? That the obnaženia paradoxically disempowers us. And people start looking around, the resistance starts looking around for the thing that is concealed as the secret, if revealed, that will free us. But I feel like the problem is not what remains concealed. I'm sure there are details, but basically all of this horrific atrocity is right there in front of our face. The problem is not what's concealed. The problem is what we've managed to normalize.
Professor Shore, thank you so much for this slightly scary, sobering, if necessary, conversation. Really, really appreciate it. By the way, where can people find your work? I think you have social media. You have Twitter or X.
Yeah, I'm on Bluesky. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I have a research assistant who is on Instagram for me. I have a faculty webpage at the Munk School where I think they post some of my text. I'm very findable.
Okay, awesome. Again, thank you so much, and I hope we get to do this again in the future.
Yeah. Oh, you're very welcome. I hope we'll speak in person at some point.
Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, follow and rate on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, marketing tutorials. Insist, it's really important that I hassle you about that, so I'm doing it. Also, if you'd like to, please support me on Patreon. This is a one-person podcast. I know I say this every time, but I do everything by my little old self. There's no team behind me. It's very, very sad, I know. But you can help by hopping on Patreon and finding the Smart Cookies podcast on there. And then last but certainly not least, I have to thank my existing patrons. Tovarishi and tovarischitze, without you, there would be no Smart Cookies, which makes you the real actual producers of this show. So eternal thanks to Matija Renčel, Dumi Holdis, Andraš Rakušček, Florian Hauer, Peter Karba, Matija Zupančič, Dejan Žulnir, Darej, Rok Tržan, Saša Vipotnik, Neven Cvijanović, Juš Premrov, Nate Sir, Goran Ivašić, Anže Sever, Ole, Marin Ferrara, Aljaš Mahar, Štrole, Ajda, Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinho, Goran, Gordon Lorenzo, Jurečuk, Mila, Carmen, Veronica, and Taichi. Thank you so much. Your support means the world to me.